The candle on Thomas Merrick's helmet guttered in the suffocating darkness, casting his shadow across stone walls that seemed to pulse with each flicker. 2,000 feet below the surface, a full mile beneath the Atlantic Ocean. The weight of all that water pressed down on his mind like a physical thing, though the mine's scorching heat made him forget the cold depths above. Thomas had worked the Levant Mine for 3 years, and he'd learned to ignore the whispers. Every man who went deep enough heard them eventually, soft voices in the darkness between the hammer strikes, words in languages that predated English, predated anything human. The old-timers said it was just the mine settling, the ocean pressing down, your mind playing tricks in the heat and black. But Thomas knew better. He'd seen the marks on the walls in the deepest tunnels, symbols scratched into stone that couldn't have been made by pickaxes or drills, patterns that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to shift when you turned away. The foreman had ordered them covered with wooden supports, buried behind false walls. Don't speak of it. Don't look at it. Just dig. October 20th, 1919. The morning shift was ending, and Thomas packed his tools with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Not from exhaustion, from what he'd found 3 hours earlier in the new tunnel they'd blasted through that morning. A chamber, perfectly circular. The walls were smooth as glass despite being hundreds of years old, carved into the bedrock beneath the seabed. And in the center, a shaft dropping into darkness so absolute his candle couldn't penetrate it. When he'd thrown a stone down, he'd counted to 30 before hearing it strike something far below. Something that made a wet, organic sound instead of a crack against rock. He'd told William Lawry, the 14-year-old boy on his crew, to stay away from that tunnel. Don't go near it. Don't even look at it. The boy had nodded, his young face pale in the candlelight, understanding something in Thomas's tone that transcended words. Now, as Thomas joined the crowd of miners gathering at the man engine shaft, he couldn't shake the feeling that finding that chamber had broken something. A seal, a barrier between worlds that should never have been breached. The man engine was ancient. Installed in 1857, 62 years of constant use had rotted its components, worn down every joint and bracket. The wooden platforms shuddered as the massive rod lifted and lowered, the 24-ton weight of it groaning with each cycle. Management had ignored every complaint, every warning. Replacing it would cost too much. Thomas stepped onto a platform as it descended, gripping the handlebar at chest height. Around him, over 100 miners did the same, filling the shaft nearly to capacity. The platforms rose 12 feet. Men stepped off onto wall-mounted ledges, waited for the next cycle, stepped back on. 18 inches from the top of the stroke, Thomas prepared to step off onto the surface platform. Fresh air was so close he could almost taste it. Around him, men were already reaching for the ledge. Then the bracket broke. The sound was like a gunshot in the confined space, a sharp crack of metal giving way. For one suspended moment, everything was still. Thomas saw the foreman's face at the surface, mouth opening in horror. Then they fell. The platform dropped from beneath Thomas's feet. He held onto the handlebar as the massive wooden rod plummeted, buckling and bending as it tore through the catchwings meant to stop exactly this. Men screamed, a sound that rose and fell as they dropped into darkness, their candles blown out by the sudden rush of air. Thomas's grip was torn away after the first 60 feet. He hit a wooden beam, felt ribs crack, then was falling again. The shaft walls rushed past in absolute blackness now. He heard the sickening thuds of bodies striking stone, the crack of breaking bones, the wet sounds of impacts that ended abruptly. The top 300 feet of the rod snapped off above him. For a moment, he could see it silhouetted against the distant circle of light at the surface, a massive wooden spear plunging down toward him. Then it was lost in the darkness, but he could hear it coming, the roar of it falling, the scrape of it against stone. Thomas slammed into something, a ledge, a platform, he couldn't tell. The impact drove the air from his lungs. He grabbed blindly and caught a handhold just as the section of rod above him thundered past. So close he felt the wind of its passage. It struck the shaft wall 300 feet below with a sound like the earth breaking open. Dust filled the shaft. Stone and wooden debris rained down. Thomas hung in the darkness, unable to breathe, his ribs screaming. Above him, he heard the groaning of destabilized supports. Below him, silence. Then the screaming started, not from men, from the mine itself. It began as a low vibration, a frequency that made Thomas's teeth ache and his vision blur despite the darkness. It rose in pitch slowly, steadily, like something massive drawing breath after a long sleep. The sound came from below, from the deep places, from tunnels that stretched beneath the ocean floor. From the chamber he'd found that morning. Thomas fumbled for his waterproof match container with fingers that wouldn't cooperate. His hands were slick with blood, his own or someone else's, he couldn't tell. Finally, he got a match lit. The tiny flame revealed a nightmare. He was clinging to the remains of a wooden platform at about 320 feet depth. The shaft above him was choked with debris, broken beams, twisted metal, bodies wedged between stone and wood. The shaft below was worse. The fallen section of rod had pierced the wall, taking out the supports and sealing the passage with hundreds of pounds of wreckage. But that wasn't. What made Thomas's hands shake so badly, he nearly dropped the match. The walls were moving, not settling or shifting, moving with purpose. The stone itself rippled like water, and through those ripples, things were emerging. Pale, segmented appendages too thin to support their own weight, yet moving with horrible strength. They probed the wreckage, testing it, and wherever they touched, the wood began to rot. Not slowly, instantly, turning to black mush that dripped down into the depths. The match burned Thomas's fingers. He dropped it, and the darkness returned. Around him, he heard other survivors trying to relight their candles. John Grenfell's voice called out from somewhere above, asking for a count. 13 voices answered, 13 survivors in his section of the shaft. Thomas knew there had been over 100 men on the engine when it fell. "Don't use the lights," Thomas tried to shout, but his broken ribs turned it into a wheeze. "Don't let it see." Too late. Candles flared to life throughout the shaft, and in their light, Thomas saw what had been waiting for them in the darkness. They weren't creatures, not exactly. They were more like the absence of creatures, hollow spaces in reality shaped like twisted, elongated human forms. Where they moved, the air itself seemed to die, turning cold despite the mine's natural heat. Their faces were worst, smooth and featureless, except for mouths that opened too wide, revealing nothing inside. Not darkness, nothing, a void that light couldn't enter. One was crawling up the wall toward William Lorry. The boy had survived the fall, was clinging to a beam 30 feet above Thomas. His young face was streaked with blood and coal dust, and he was staring at the thing approaching him with an expression beyond terror, beyond sanity. "William!" Thomas tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Something in his spine had broken. He could feel his legs, could feel them screaming in pain, but they wouldn't obey. "William, close your eyes. Don't look at it." The boy looked at Thomas instead, and something in his expression broke Thomas's heart. William knew, he understood. The thing was going to reach him, and there was nothing anyone could do. Then William did something that Thomas would never forget, would never understand. The boy smiled. Not a frightened smile, not brave defiance, a smile of recognition. "It's singing," William said, his voice clear and calm in the chaos. "Can't you hear it? It's beautiful." The thing touched William's leg. The boy's scream started human and ended as something else entirely. A sound that echoed through the shaft and seemed to come from much farther away than his physical location. His body convulsed, arching backward at an angle that snapped his spine. But he didn't fall. The thing held him, and as Thomas watched in horror, William's skin began to darken. Not with blood or bruising, with symbols. The same symbols Thomas had seen on the walls of that hidden chamber. They spread across William's flesh like ink in water, covering every inch of exposed skin. His eyes rolled back, showing only whites that began to take on a phosphorescent glow. His mouth opened, and that horrible knot sound came out again. But now it was forming words in a language that predated human speech. Above them, more survivors were screaming. Not all from pain. Some had seen what Thomas had seen. Some were trying to climb higher, scrambling over debris and corpses. Others sat frozen, staring at the things emerging from the walls with expressions of rapture. John Grenfell's voice rose above the chaos. The skip shaft. Everyone to the skip shaft! There are emergency ladders. One of the void things reached John before he could finish. It didn't grab him. It simply passed through the space he occupied. John's scream cut off mid-breath. For a moment his body remained standing, still gripping the wooden beam. Then it crumbled, literally crumbled. Like a sand sculpture caught in wind, pieces of John Grenfell sifting down through the debris and into the darkness below. Thomas watched it happen, watched his friend reduced to dust and ash. And he understood then that this wasn't a rescue situation. This was a harvest. The things were feeding. Above, at the surface, he could hear the sounds of rescue efforts beginning, voices calling down, ropes being lowered, normal human sounds that seemed impossible in the face of what was happening down here. They couldn't be allowed to come down. If they came down, if they brought more light, more life into this shaft, the things would only grow stronger. Thomas fumbled for his match container again. His plan was simple and hopeless. Create a collapse. Seal the shaft entirely. Bury the things down here along with the survivors. It was the only way to keep them from reaching the surface. But as he struck the match, he saw something that froze him in place. The broken section of rod hadn't just pierced the shaft wall. It had punched through into another chamber. And through that hole, Thomas could see a space vast beyond comprehension. His candle's light didn't reach the far wall, didn't reach the ceiling. The chamber stretched into darkness that felt aware, conscious, and it was full of them. Thousands of the void things, hanging from walls and ceiling like bats, or perhaps like chrysalises waiting to hatch. Most were still dormant, but the ones near the breach were beginning to stir. They had sensed the light, the life, the fresh blood. They were waking up. Thomas's match went out. In the darkness, he heard William's voice again, but it was wrong now. Too many tones layered over each other, some higher than human vocal cords could produce, others so low they were felt more than heard. "They've been waiting," William said, "since before the ocean, since before the land, waiting in the deep places. Waiting for someone to dig far enough. Waiting for the first door to open." "William," Thomas whispered, "fight it. You're still in there. You're still—" "I am," William agreed. "But I'm also more." "Thomas, you don't understand. This isn't an invasion. It's a homecoming. They were here first. We're the invaders. We're the infection they've been trying to purge." Above them, the first rope dropped into the shaft. A rescuer was being lowered down, his lamp casting wild shadows across the wreckage. Thomas wanted to scream at him to go back, to run, to seal the mine and never return. But the words wouldn't come. His broken ribs had punctured something vital, and he could feel his lungs filling with fluid. The rescuer was John's son, also named John. Thomas recognized his voice calling out, asking if anyone could hear him. The young man was brave, dedicated. He had no idea that he was descending into something worse than a collapsed mine shaft. He had no idea that his father was already gone. The void things began to move toward the rope, toward the light, toward the surface. They moved like smoke, like shadow, passing through solid stone as if it were water. But where they passed, the stone itself changed, becoming porous, becoming brittle, beginning to weep a dark fluid that steamed in the heat. Thomas knew then that there would be no sealing this shaft, no stopping what had been unleashed. The moment he'd broken through into that chamber, the moment he'd exposed it to air and light and human presence, he'd doomed them all. Not just the miners, not just Cornwall, all of it, because the things weren't limited to this mine. They were in the rock, in the deep places, in the forgotten spaces beneath the world. The Levant Mine had simply been the weakest point, the thinnest barrier. And now that barrier was broken. Young John's lamp illuminated the shaft above Thomas. In its light, Thomas could see that the stone walls were now completely covered with those ancient symbols. They glowed with a sickly green phosphorescence, pulsing in rhythm with the terrible singing that only William and the other infected could hear. Thomas's vision was fading, drowning from the inside, unable to move, unable to warn anyone. He watched young John descend closer, closer, his lamp driving back shadows that had gained substance and intention. William spoke one last time, his voice now completely inhuman, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Tell them we're sorry. Tell them it was an accident. Tell them we didn't know." "Who?" Thomas managed to choke out. "Tell who? The ones who will come after, the ones who will wonder what happened here. Tell them we opened a door we didn't know existed. Tell them some doors should stay closed. Tell them—" William's body jerked violently, his back arching further, bones breaking with soft pops. The symbols on his skin began to glow brighter, brighter, until Thomas had to close his eyes against the light. Even through his eyelids he could see it, burning like a sun in the depths. Then everything went dark. Not the darkness of extinguished candles or failed lamps. A darkness that was absolute, that devoured light itself. Young John's lamp went out. The symbols stopped glowing. Even the match Thomas had been holding simply ceased to exist, its flame snuffed without smoke or ember. In that perfect blackness, Thomas heard footsteps. Many footsteps, coming up from below, coming from the chamber, coming from the deep places. They were leaving, ascending, moving toward the surface where 300 workers and rescuers waited, unknowing. Thomas's last thought before the darkness took him was a prayer that someone would believe the reports, that someone would understand what had been released, that someone would find a way to seal it again before it spread beyond the mine, beyond Cornwall, beyond England. But he knew with the certainty of the dying that no one would believe. How could they? How could anyone believe that beneath the mines, beneath the ocean floor, beneath everything humanity knew, there were spaces between spaces where things older than evolution had been waiting? How could anyone believe that the Levant Mine disaster wasn't an accident at all? It was an awakening. 3 days later, after round-the-clock rescue efforts, 31 miners were confirmed dead. 19 others suffered injuries. The official report blamed a faulty bracket at the top of the man engine, metal fatigue, poor maintenance, negligence perhaps, but not criminal. No one mentioned the survivors who came up screaming about things in the dark. No one mentioned the rescue workers who refused to go back down after their first descent, who quit their jobs and left Cornwall entirely. No one mentioned that young William Lawrie, who'd been pulled from the wreckage after 15 hours, never spoke another word for the rest of his life, just stared at walls and drew symbols that doctors called trauma-induced compulsions. No one mentioned that the mine's owner ordered the underground portions sealed immediately, rather than attempting to recover the bodies that remained. No one mentioned that 3 of the rescued miners died within the year, their bodies simply giving up despite their injuries having healed, and no one mentioned that the singing never stopped. Miners in neighboring shafts reported hearing it in the deep tunnels, up high, sound like voices in harmony, like 1,000 throats singing in unison, like something massive drawing breath in the spaces between rock. The Levant Mine, the East Pool Mine. Mines across Cornwall began reporting the same phenomena, whistling in the dark. Voices where no one should be, symbols appearing on walls overnight. Workers disappearing in sealed tunnels, their candles found still burning, but the men gone. Vanished. By 1930, the Levant Mine closed permanently, not because of the Depression, though that was the official reason, but because no one would work there anymore. The few who tried reported that the darkness felt different now, felt aware, felt hungry. The surface structures were preserved, converted to historical exhibits. Tours were given. School children learned about the tragic accident of 1919, about the brave rescue workers, about mining conditions in the early industrial age. But the underground portions remained sealed, welded shut with thick steel plates, filled with concrete in some sections, posted with warnings about toxic gases and unstable structures. The real reason for the seals was never recorded in any official document, but the workers who installed them knew. They'd heard the sounds from below, had seen the way shadows moved independently of light sources, had felt the cold spots in a mine that should have been sweltering, had found the symbols, hundreds of them now, thousands, spreading through the rock like a cancer. They sealed it fast and they sealed it well, and they never went back. Today, the Levant Mine sits on the Cornish coast, its beam engine maintained by the National Trust, its surface buildings preserved as monuments to industrial heritage. Tourists visit. Photographers capture stunning images of the engine house against the Atlantic sunset, but no one goes underground. The entrances remain sealed, and sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is right, visitors report hearing something from deep below. Not machinery, not the ocean, something else. Singing. Always singing. And in those moments, if you press your ear to the stone, if you listen carefully past the wind and waves, you might hear words in that terrible harmony. Words in a language that shouldn't exist, that human throats weren't meant to form. Words that sound almost like an invitation. The mine is still there. The seals are still in place. The symbols are still spreading through the rock, deeper into Cornwall's earth, following ore veins and fault lines like arteries, spreading outward, spreading upward, waiting for the next time someone digs too deep, waiting for the next door to open, waiting for the next harvest, because the things in the dark places learned something in 1919. They learned that humanity would come to them, eventually, inevitably. All they had to do was wait, and they were very, very good at waiting.